Hello world! Welcome to Learning Java, one byte at a time. This is video 45 in a tutorial series geared at bringing the wonderful wide world of Java to those with little or no programming experience. This video is a continuation of the development of the Bookr application, a vehicle appraisal app. In the last video, we performed unit testing on the view class to make sure that our user interface was working correctly. And it looks like all of the buttons and fields are there, and they seem to be functioning properly. But the view object is only one part of the model view controller equation. So in an MVC design pattern, we also need to have a model and a controller. So the model generally instantiates the classes or fields that are going to be necessary for the project, and the controller acts as an interface between the model and the view. In our case, the model is going to instantiate the vehicle bluebook instance and the vehicle add generator instance. Now the controller is going to be responsible for having the event listeners. And so essentially what's going to happen is the controller is going to have defined an action event and an action event listener. And a listener is going to listen for the event, and when it hears it, it captures it and passes it to a method in the controller so that our controller can do something fun with it. And so if we jump over here to our Notepad++ app, you'll see I have open a file called controller.java. And so the first thing we need to do is reference our package to make sure that everything's included in the same package. And next we're going to need to make a few imports. Now in our case, we're going to need to instantiate an action event and then an action listener to handle that event. So if we import from java.awt.event the action event class, and from the same library, let's import the action listener class. Now we're also going to need to have a file chooser because the save button and load button are going to need to be able to access those saved files. So we can make use of, in the javax.swing library, a J file chooser. And this is just a very simple dialog box that pops up and allows the user to select files from whatever location we point it towards, which in this case will probably be the folder that this project resides in on the user's hard drive. So let's import the JFileChooser object. And the last import we're going to need is, since we're going to make use of an array list, we're going to need to import from the java.util library the array list object. And that takes care of all of our imports. So now we're going to go ahead and define our class, which we know is going to be a public class called controller. And in an instance of this class, we're going to have three fields. We're going to need to have a private view that we'll call view, which is going to be an instance of our view object, a private model that we'll call model, which is going to be an instance of the model class that we'll design in the next video. And then finally, we're going to have a private vehicle that we'll call vehicle. So now in the constructor, which is just going to be public controller, we're going to pass through a view and a model. And then using this keyword, we're going to reference an instance of a constructed class of the controller and access its view field and assign it an instance of whatever view gets passed through in the parameters. We'll do the same thing with the model. Lastly, if you remember, in the view class, we actually declared a couple of listeners. And so we had the checkbox for the previous owners, we had a add button for generate add, we had a button for a new project, we had a button for save, and a button for load. And buttons being view objects, they are able to have listeners added to them. And so we define these methods in the view class as being vehicle previous owners checkbox listener, vehicle generate add button listener, vehicle new button listener, vehicle save button listener, and the vehicle load button listener. And these methods that we define, we pass through an action listener that we're calling listener. And since these view objects are allowed to have listeners assigned to them, whenever this method is called, all we do is grab that view object and we add the action listener that we're passing through in the parameter called listener. Once that listener is added to that view item, whenever anything happens to it, the listener will capture that action and pass it to wherever we want to. And so now the purpose of making those methods was so that we could tap into them over here in our controller. So now if we have an instance of this controller class, and we know that this controller class has a view field which we've assigned a view object to, we can access that view by using the this keyword, then tapping into its view class, and then the view class having those methods, we can tap into those methods by using the name of the method. In this case, vehicle previous owner's checkbox listener. And then, if you remember, we'll jump back over here to the view class just to refresh the memory. It is expecting an action listener to be passed through, and the action listener we pass through is going to be what it attaches to that view item. And so we're going to need to pass through an action listener. Now we've imported the action listener class. We could instantiate that somewhere here in the class, but just to make things a little more tidy, let's do an inline instantiation. And so rather than declaring it somewhere else in the class, we'll go ahead and instantiate it. We'll declare and instantiate it right here in the as an argument to pass it through. So we're going to do a new action listener, and we're going to call this one vehicle enable previous owner's text field, and that method we'll write in a moment. And the reason we're doing a text field is because whenever somebody clicks the previous owner's checkbox, we want to be able to do something with the text field. And we're actually going to need to name that listener, just like that. So it'll be vehicle enable previous owner's text field listener. That is a mouthful. So the next thing we need to do is make a reference to the other methods, the other action listener methods that we've defined in the view class by accessing a reference to this instance, its own view field, and then we will do the save button, which I believe we've called the vehicle save button listener. And that as well is going to be expecting a listener item. So we'll pass through an instance of something that we're going to define a little bit here called the vehicle save listener. Next, we're going to access the vehicle load button listener method. And we'll pass through an instance of a method that we'll create, which will be an action listener method, and we'll call this one vehicle load listener. Then we need to access the vehicle generate add button. And this is also called listener. And with that, we'll pass through an instance of a method that we'll declare that we're going to call vehicle generate add listener. Finally, we have the vehicle new button listener. And we're going to pass through an instance of a method called vehicle new listener, just like that. Hopefully I got all the spelling right there. And that's going to be everything we need in a constructor. So outside of the constructor, but still within the class, we're going to define an inner class. These inner classes are going to be the action listeners that we're going to attach right here. We're going to pass through instances of the listener methods we're going to declare as an inner class as parameters to these methods in the view class that we're referencing by referencing an instance of our controller object and its view property. It's kind of complex, but I think it'll all come together here in the end. So let's define an inner class. We've named it, we'll start with the previous owner's text field listener. So it's going to be vehicle enable previous owner's text field listener. And we're going to tell Java that this is going to implement the action listener that we've imported. And so as an interface, if we're going to implement it, it's going to have some number of fields and methods that we need to override, because interfaces will only have, they're going to have empty fields or methods. They're going to have things that are going to be there as part of the contract of the interface, but they themselves are not going to have any sort of content. But we must override that content. We must override those fields and methods so that we can then ourselves add that content. So in the case of an action listener, there's going to be one method that we need to override, and we will use an annotation to let Java know that this is overriding the method, and it's going to be a public void called action performed. This one's going to be expecting an action event, which is also an import that we made. And when that event gets passed through, here in this code block is where we're going to tell Java what to do whenever this happens. So whenever anybody clicks the vehicle previous owner's checkbox, and that checkbox which has a listener method that we define in the view class, this instance of the view class that we have, which has this method, is going to be expecting a listener pass through. This listener that we're passing through is being defined over here. It implements an action listener so that it adheres to a contract of an action listener, and in adherence to that contract, it must override this one method. This one method is the action performed. And so what's going to happen when the vehicle previous owner's checkbox is clicked? Well, we're going to have a text field perform some action. In this case, we're going to either enable or disable the text field. So the first thing we need to do is let's check to see if the previous owner's checkbox is not enabled. So we'll use a bang. We'll check view, get vehicle previous owners enabled, which is a getter method that we define in the view class. And if it is not enabled, then we're going to take the view, set vehicle previous owners enabled, which is a reference to the text field, and we'll set that equal to false. So we're essentially saying that if, when this action is performed, if that brings it to a state of not being checked, then take the text field and set it to not being enabled. Else, if when this action is performed, it results in the checkbox being checked, we'll take that same view item and we'll set it to being enabled. By passing through true. And that is everything we need to do for that one action listener. So now the next action listener we can handle is going to be the save listener. Now the save listener is going to be a little more complex because this is going to bring in the J file chooser. And so let's define this as an inner class. We've named it vehicle save listener. This save listener is going to implement an action listener, and because it's implementing it, we must override the single class, which is the action performed class, or the action performed method rather. And that is going to expect an action event that we'll call E. And so now, whenever the save button is clicked, we need to open up a file chooser. We need to take all of the data that's going to be in the view object and basically concatenate it to something like an array that we can then pass through as being something that we could save. Then we're going to, whenever we have a proper file saver that's opened and successfully, we're going to access the data access object that we created and tell it to save the data. So this is going to be a little complex, but just bear with me. So whenever that save button is clicked, first thing we need to do is instantiate our J file chooser. We're just going to call it a save file chooser, and we'll set it equal to a new instance of the J file chooser, like so. Now it's going to be expecting a couple of parameters. The first parameter is going to be what's the location it's going to open up to whenever we have that dialog open up. So whenever that window opens up, what folder do we want to have showing? And so just for right now, I'm going to leave that blank because this is going to depend on where you're going to be housing the project. But eventually it could be something like the destination of a package or any folder or file of your choosing. But for right now, we'll go ahead and leave that blank. We'll fill that in later during the testing. Now that we have our JFileChooser object, let's go ahead and define an integer that we're going to call our R value, and we're going to set it equal to SaveFileChooser. And the SaveFileChooser has a method called showSaveDialog. And it's going to need a view to pass it on to, and so we're just going to use the view instance that we pass through when we instantiate the controller. Then we're going to need to perform a check. If the R value is equal to JFileChooser dot approve option, which means if it was successfully saved, then we're going to need to take all of our data, package it up, and send it to our data access object. Now if it's not, else, we're going to need to access our view. We, if you remember, had a method called display alert, and we're going to make a little alert to the user. We're going to use the save file chooser object that we created, and it has a method called get selected file. And that method has a method called get name. And we will concatenate, and we'll just give a little message. So it's going to be the name of the file that we're attempting to save, plus a little extra text that we're going to say could not save, like that. And that's in the case that it was not successful. That's in the else statement. Now, if in fact the JFile chooser had an approve option, so if the save was successful, here's where we're going to need to package up all of that data. And the way that we're going to do that is declaring a string array, because if you remember, the data access object accepts string arrays and gives out string arrays. So we'll have a string array that we'll call data. We'll set it equal to a new string array. And we can go ahead and just load up the array right now because we know everything that needs to go in here. This is going to be accessing all of the fields of the view object. And so the vehicle name field, the vehicle make field, all of that, we need to go ahead and grab the contents of that and bring it into this string array. And since it's a string array, the contents that are not strings, such as the base cost and the commission cost, need to be converted to strings. So we'll cast those to strings. And so one by one, we'll go through all of the fields, and I'll go ahead and bring up that interface one more time. One by one, we'll go through all of these fields, snag all the data, make sure that if it's not a string, that we cast it to a string. We'll package it all up under this array called this string array called data, and then we will send that through to the data access object, which will save it. And so if you remember, we do have getters and setters, and the getters are in charge of returning the data from the view object. And we can just go down the line. We can start with the view.getVehicleName method. And since it's an array, we can separate all of these with commas. We'll do the view.getVehicleMake, the view.getVehicle, I believe it's the vehicle model. And since the white space is ignored, we can go ahead and just do some carriage returns to make this a little bit more readable. We can do, we'll need to access the string.valueOf to convert to a string. And it's going to be the view.getVehicleBaseCost, which should return an integer, and that integer gets cast to a string right here. Next, we can do a string.valueOf the view.getVehicleYear, like so. After that, it's going to be view.getVehicleTransmission, which, if you remember, returns whichever type of transmission it is from that button group. The view.getVehicleDrive. We'll need the string value again, string.valueOf, and this is going to be the view.getVehicleAirbags, which of course was a Boolean. After that, we can get a string value, the view.getVehicleABS. And now I'm thinking that we should have named this to is airbags and is ABS. I don't remember that we did or not. So let's check our getters and see what it is in fact that we named that. So we have, so we do in fact have get vehicle airbags, get vehicle ABS. Conventionally, we would have called these methods is vehicle airbags and is vehicle ABS because they're Booleans. That's just convention, but just wanted to make sure that we weren't going to have any bugs. It is in fact get vehicle airbags and get vehicle ABS, so we'll go ahead and go with that. After the ABS, we're going to have the string.valueOf, and that's going to be a view.getVehicle rear wheel or rear view camera, I believe. Getting ahead of myself. It's going to be get vehicle rear view camera. And then after that, we can get the vehicle grade. Then we'll need the string.valueOf again to return a string of the view.getVehicleMileage. After that, we'll do a string.valueOf the view.getVehiclePreviousOwners. The string.valueOf a get vehicle, I believe it's keyless entry. Make sure we close out that parenthesis, and then it's going to be string.valueOf view.get vehicle premium sound, then a string.valueOf view.get vehicle GPS navigation. And after that, we have view.getVehicleClass, the string value of view.getVehicleAccidentHistory, and then we have the, come down here one more line, the string value of our view.getVehicleCommissionRate. If I spell commission rate, and I believe that should be everything that we're going to need in the array. Let me just go ahead and cycle through one more time to make sure we've got it all. We've got the vehicle name, the make, the model. We've got the base cost, the year. We've got the transmission, the drive. Then we've got the airbags, the ABS, the rear view camera. Then we've got the grade, the mileage, previous owners. Then we've got the keyless entry, the premium sound. We've got the GPS. We've got the class, any accident history, and then the commission rate. So I do believe that that is all of the vehicle properties that we could have access to. We've got all of those loaded into our array, our string array called data. And so now we're going to check to make sure that our data access object can save this data by saying if dao.saveData. It's going to be expecting that string array that we've called data, and our save file chooser has given us a file name, so we're going to do get selected file dot get name, like so, and we need to close off 1, 2 parentheses. Now, if in fact that returns successful, in that case we're going to use our display alert from the view and pass through the save file chooser get selected file dot get name. Make sure I have parentheses there since that's a method, dot get name. And we're going to concatenate a string that says that that file name saved successful, like so. And then we've already defined our else statement. Let me go ahead and close this off with a parenthesis and a semicolon. We've already defined our else statement as being could not save. I have one too many here. And then in the case that it could not save, we will print that message out to the console. Now outside of that, we can close off our if-else block, like so. And we'll put one more here to close off our if block. And then down here, we can check our R value equals J file, let me spell that right, chooser dot cancel option. So in the case that the user clicks that they cancel the save, then we can also provide a little dialog by using the view display alert and just say that we realized the save was canceled, like so. Close out that if block. And then that will actually close off that entire action performed. And so, since this video is running a little bit long, I'm going to go ahead and cut it now, and we'll come back for the next video to finish the controller class. Not too much more, just the rest of the action listeners. Anyway, hopefully this video was fun, and I look forward to seeing everyone back again soon in the very next video. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful night.